Now that we're done with the debt architecture and we've sort of figured out that there are so many actors and it's not as simple as just a country borrowing from a country, let's look at a few things around terminologies. And debt finance, foreign debt, domestic debt, debt service plus debt interest service, principal plus interest, debt to GDP ratio, debt service to tax revenue ratio, sovereign bonds, treasury bill, euro bond, debt restructuring, debt reprofiling, default cancellation, transparency swaps, and US denominated debt. These are just some of the terminologies that we must all be very familiar with and be very comfortable in using. The slides are going to be shared, but I just want to focus on a few because in the 31 countries that are represented here, there's a few that are very common and popular amongst our government and particularly our ministers of finance. There's one called a debt swap. Now, for some of the countries that are going through debt challenges, some of the advice that's being given to them is to take on something called a debt swap or to introduce something called a debt swap. Now, in very simple terms, debt swaps are agreements between government and one or more of its creditors to replace the existing sovereign debt with a different type of liability. And it may include a spending commitment towards a specific goal. So many of you will have heard of a debt for climate swap. Does that sound familiar? Debt for climate swap? Anyone? Just put your hand up. Someone from this side of the room. Apart from an Aphrodite staff member. Anyone else heard of a debt for education swap? Debt for gender swap? Okay, there's someone there at least who's heard of these. Who has heard of a Eurobond? You've got to have heard of a Eurobond, this side of the room. You have got to have heard of it. Don't feel shy, just put your hand up. No, I'm not going to ask you to answer any question. ODS debt. Who has heard of ODS debt? So ODS debt refers to debt that is taken without the consent of people, or is when it is borrowed, it is not used for the intended purposes for which it was borrowed. And therefore, it makes it almost non-payable in legal terms, right? It is disputed by different people, especially lawyers and accountants, as to whether ODS debt should be paid or not be paid, depending on how you define it. It's a very contentious issue, but it is one that is coming up more and more, particularly in the context of irresponsible lending and irresponsible borrowing. So it's something for you to, as journalists, to start thinking about. It's also something that is also very important in the context of the African Union's theme on reparation and reparative justice. Thinking about historical colonial debt, thinking about debt, for example, in the case of South Africa, the debt that was taken on during the apartheid era. Yeah, that debt was, largely considered to have been taken on without the consent of, South Africans. But it is a debt overhang. In Zimbabwe, that exists. Outside of the continent, we have cases like in Pakistan, where you have that kind of situation. Now, there is no general agreed principle of how to deal with ODS debt, right? But it is a term and it is a way in which we need to be able to consider how to deal with it. The debt to GDP ratio is basically measures how much debt you have versus the size of the economy. And that determines how much a country can borrow. If you have a high debt to GDP ratio, it means you have a high debt burden, which means sometimes you're told, please stop borrowing or reduce the rate at which you're borrowing. If you have a low debt to GDP ratio, then it means you have a low debt burden. One new term that we need to pay attention to is debt service to tax revenue ratio. It's not one that is used very commonly, but increasingly is becoming very important in linking debt servicing with tax policy. Now, for those of you who are from Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, you will realize that all of a sudden our tax policies have become extremely regressive. They are the expansion of the VAT envelope or basket, the increase in VAT alone, or the introduction of very regressive taxes, excise taxes, consumption taxes, and so on. And the reason for that is because the amount of debt servicing that is being used from the tax revenue being collected is increasing. Okay? So as journalists, when you're following your budget cycle, when you're looking at the tax proposals and the financing proposals that the government is putting forward with regard to how it's going to finance its budget, please pay attention to this ratio, because it's a critical ratio in how it influences tax policy. Because the more you allocate to debt servicing, the less tax revenue you have to invest in development, the less tax revenue you have to invest in public services. Okay? And that's where you have the vicious cycle of then having to borrow and introduce regressive taxes. So just to give a bit of an example of the data that's out there, and as journalists, how you can support the narrative around the debt situation and how to understand our debt situation. The graph here shows the last 24 years, 14 years of debt from 2009 to 2023, the evolution of different types of creditors. There's bilateral, excluding China, bilateral, including China, multilateral, private, excluding China, and private, including China. So that's why I said the China issue is very controversial, but it's also very misunderstood. It is both a bilateral lender to the continent, country to country or government to government, but it also has a lot of private state-owned enterprises that engage in lending to the continent. So it's a very complex creditor to the continent, and we must not be very quick to dive in and draw conclusions around how China interacts with regard to its lending to the continent. But for the purposes of understanding the debt situation on the continent, you can see the role of private debt, whether you include or exclude China. It has grown significantly in the last 14 years. And part of it explains the complexity that we're having with countries that are defaulting, but also the complexity in trying to address restructuring and debt relief, which I'm going to come to in a little while. This is just, again, a continental view of the debt to GDP ratio. And you can see it's fairly high. Yeah, it's getting close to above 25, 26%. Yeah. And the IMF will tell you, well, actually, this doesn't look so bad for our continent. So you can still actually continue to borrow more. But it's horrendous when you look at what the continent is actually generating in tax revenue, what it's generating in terms of its own revenues, right? So I think it's very, very important for us to pay attention to what we are producing vis-a-vis what we are borrowing. Those two ratios are not matching. And that is why we have more than 27 countries that are in debt distress or in risk of being in debt distress, and 4 have defaulted. And here is some of the explanations as to why that might be the case. Our economic structure is still very rudimentary. It's based on raw materials and commodity dependency. Many of low value added goods are what we export. The raw materials that we do export are very vulnerable to global price fluctuations. And that means that vulnerability means it affects the revenue streams. Okay? And so when I was talking about the political economy, when I was talking about did our debt crisis start in the 1970s, this tells you that those are false statements. The structure of our economies are extractive, they are colonial. Yeah? I'm from Kenya. The structure of Kenya's economy has not changed since independence. Maybe what we export as raw materials has changed. We've stopped doing coffee and tea as the main ones. We now do flowers and fish and some vegetables, right? But it's still raw commodities, basic, right? So our economies have not transformed, but the type of exports maybe might have changed in the last 60 years or so. So there's very little value addition, which means our revenue streams are very low. But our populations have grown, our demands for public services have increased, and therefore you have those deficits, which is forcing our governments to borrow. So very important to understand that context of our export structure, our economic structure, in explaining why we find ourselves in this perpetual cycle on debt. I have an image here, I hope you can see. How many of you have one of those gadgets? Can you just lift it up if you have one of those gadgets? This side of the room, you must have a phone. I see 3 phones facing me. Yeah, I see 3 phones facing me. Right. Again, the slides will be shared with you, but in your gadgets that you're holding up and taking pictures of my lovely shirt, the components in that phone, over 50% of the materials in that phone are found on this continent. Yeah? But look at where the phone is manufactured. Look at where the phone is manufactured. It's not manufactured on the continent. So you're exporting the lithium or the cobalt at $1, but importing the phone at $300, or even more if you're an iPhone user. Yeah? That's what we mean about the economic structure that we have, that is largely extractive in nature, that is largely dominated by the export of raw materials and so on. So very important for us to think about that.